It's one of the most controversial policy proposals in years, an idea that, if carried out, would have ramifications for the whole of North America. Since this spring, there's been a steady drumbeat on parts of the American right for military intervention in Mexico, to use special forces, sophisticated cyber tools, or even missiles to target cartels. The goal? To destroy drug laboratories and cripple the ability of gangs to create fentanyl, the drug that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. In defense circles, the plan is unpopular. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, has taken great pains to discourage it. Yet this may not ultimately matter. With the 2024 election on the horizon, multiple Republican candidates have expressed a desire to intervene in Mexico. In Congress, bills have been put forward to authorize action against the cartels. Should the GOP win big next year, it's possible military intervention could actually take place. And hence this video, hence our attempt to try and seriously analyze this proposal, to both understand the reasoning and predict how a deployment might actually play out. Because far from being a cakewalk, going to war with Mexico's cartels could turn out to be one of the most complex operations the US military has ever undertaken. The idea of using the military against Mexico's cartels has long kicked around the fringes of American discourse, but this spring it went vaulting into the mainstream. Back in March, former Attorney General William P. Barr wrote in praise of a joint resolution in the House of Representatives that would give the president the power to deploy troops in Mexico. A move he claimed was justified by saying, "These narco-terrorist groups are more like ISIS than the American mafia." A month later, Senator Lindsey Graham hammered the point on Fox to quote, "We need to put our military into the game to stop this. We are literally under attack. There are more Americans being killed by Mexican drug cartels than ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Germans, and Japanese combined on the homeland." Nor were Barr and Graham the only ones. Representative Mike Walsh of Florida has called for using drones and cyber capabilities against the cartels. Of the 2024 Republican primary contenders, 3 have come forward in support of similar moves, including Nikki Haley and Vivek Ramaswamy. Clearly, this is no longer a fringe position, but one that's become almost mainstream. And that raises an obvious question. Where did this idea come from? Well, the feeling that Mexico can't handle its own problems has been a feature of American politics for decades. Frustrated with the brutality of cartels, both Barack Obama and George W. Bush seriously considered designating them as foreign terrorist organizations, a move that would give the US wider powers to freeze assets, implement travel bans, and prosecute anyone who materially supports them. In both cases, the plans were abandoned after pushback from the Mexican government. Same deal with Donald Trump. Following the 2019 slaying of 9 dual US-Mexican nationals in a burst of gang violence, the president tweeted, "This is the time for Mexico, with the help of the United States, to wage war on the drug cartels and wipe them off the face of the earth." He later clarified he meant slapping them with terrorist designation. Once again, though, the plan was rejected over the massive damage that it would cause to US-Mexico relations. Yet this wouldn't be the last time the 45th president toyed with fighting the cartels. In the Trump era, as you remember, issues around the southern border took on massive importance in US political life. This was compounded by a sense that previous policies had failed. Even as Congress beefed up border security and the president promised to build a wall, record amounts of drugs were flowing into US markets. In Mexico, billions of dollars provided by the US have been spent modernizing security, tackling corruption, and funding developments in poorer regions in an attempt to stop migration, an attempt that's broadly failed. Now, cartel smuggling and illegal migration are 2 separate issues. Nonetheless, they combined in the popular imagination to give a sense that the southern border was in crisis, that these were extraordinary times, and that meant extraordinary measures could be justified. The most extraordinary of all came in 2020. According to Secretary of Defense Mike Esper, Trump twice asked him about using missile strikes to destroy drug labs in Mexico. The Washington Post would later dryly sum up the defense establishment's response to, quote, "The idea was opposed by the US military." There it could have maybe ended, another Trump-era plan like buying Greenland that the president hyped for a while before forgetting about altogether. But not this time. Although Trump never ordered the strikes, he seems to have left office bitterly regretting that fact. In April 2023, it was reported he'd ordered advisors on his new election campaign to draw up battle plans to attack Mexico if he wins next year. The think tank magazine Responsible Statecraft has claimed these plans, quote, "include unilateral military strikes and troop deployments." In this, the former president is backed by the Center for Renewing America, which recently released a white paper on how the US could wage war against the cartels. Their plan envisages a joint operation with the Mexican government, one that would enable military strikes against high-value targets on Mexican soil, sort of like how Plan Colombia saw Bogota and Washington work together to destroy coca fields. The trouble is, there's no sign the Mexican government is willing to get involved. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has lashed out at the proposals, calling them irresponsible. On the American side, General Mark Miley cautioned, "I wouldn't recommend anything be done without Mexico's support." So, well, that's that then, right? You can't just conduct military operations with an unwilling partner any more than you can dance the tango solo. Or can you? Buried in the Center for Renewing America's paper is the phrase, "It is vital that Mexico not be led to believe that they have veto power to prevent the US from taking the actions necessary to secure its borders and people." That implies a future president should be willing to take unilateral action against the cartels, bombing them even if it causes a major diplomatic incident. It's an idea that sounds objectively crazy, a step too far even for the MAGA wing. But we didn't make this video just because we wanted to shake our heads in disbelief. No, we wanted to try and take this proposal seriously, to come at it on its own terms and understand the effects that it might have in the real world. And to do that, we need to first try and understand the feelings behind it, the feelings of despair and hopelessness that would make such extreme actions seem justified. Feelings powered by America's greatest modern crisis, opioids. Every single year, the US loses the equivalent of a small city's worth of lives to drug overdoses. In 2021, some 107,000 Americans died this way. In the vast majority of cases, the drug responsible was a form of opioid. Just 13 years ago, a sentence like this would have brought to mind one thing. Heroin was, for decades, the choice of opioid for users across America and responsible for most overdoses. Around 2010, though, heroin began to drop out of favor. In its place came a new wave of synthetic opioids, drugs that can be up to 100 times stronger than morphine. The most popular of all? Fentanyl. Originally synthesized back in the 1960s, small amounts of fentanyl are still used today in medical settings for vital treatments. Mostly, though, fentanyl gets used in modern America by people who've acquired it in illegal ways. Many are people who got addicted to other opioids in the era when unscrupulous pharma companies were pushing them as cure-alls for chronic pain. The vast majority, around 70%, are non-Hispanic whites. It's these people who are dying like flies in the face of America's catastrophic addiction crisis. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, opioids kill about 1,500 Americans every single week. Roughly 2/3 are caused by synthetic opioids, which in most cases means fentanyl. These are stratospheric numbers. The Washington Post has calculated that fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 49. The Council on Foreign Relations, meanwhile, estimates nearly 1 million people have been killed by opioid overdoses since 2000, a death toll on par with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a death toll that's rising. Drug overdoses in the US have quadrupled since 2010, with the biggest spike coming in the last couple of years. Perhaps it's no wonder Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas has recently called fentanyl, quote, "the single greatest challenge we face as a country." Now, if you're one of our non-American viewers, you might now be wondering, like, well, okay, Simon, this obviously sucks, but why are you covering it on your war channel? Shouldn't it be on social crisis graphics or something? Well, unfortunately not. The fentanyl crisis, you see, is extremely relevant to this episode because of where it's produced and how it's getting into the country. Last year, the US Drug Enforcement Administration seized 50 million fake prescription pills containing fentanyl at the borders. Most were intercepted not at shipping ports, but at land crossings with Mexico. The Washington Post reports fentanyl seizures on the southern border have tripled since 2020. Just a few short years ago, things were completely different. As recently as 2019, over 50% of fentanyl was shipped to the US from China. Now, though, US officials believe most of it is being produced in Mexico and shipped north by cartels. Or, as the DEA put it in a December press conference, most fentanyl, quote, is being mass-produced at secret factories in Mexico with chemicals sourced largely from China. Mexico disputes these claims. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has said that the drug is still being manufactured in Asia and the Mexican cartels are only involved in shipping it. But not according to American intelligence. In their estimation, the cartels are now the main producers and suppliers, feeding a bottomless market of Americans who each year spend over $153 billion on illegal drugs. This is why a war with the cartels has received so much attention in parts of Congress. With entire communities ravaged by opioids, with more Americans dying yearly of fentanyl overdoses than died in the entire Vietnam War, perhaps it's no wonder people are yearning to punish the guilty parties. To do with military firepower what the Mexican authorities seem unable to do themselves. Unfortunately, if history is a guide, doing so might cause more problems than it solves. Every year in Mexico, roughly 30,000 people are murdered. Some of this undoubtedly comes from stuff cops deal with everywhere, drunken fights, inter-family conflict, but staggering numbers are linked to the country's gangs. Law enforcement, students, journalists, activists, politicians, the list of those targeted by the cartels is long, it is grim, and it is unrelenting. A grimness compounded by the sadistic methods gang members often employ. With statistics like this in mind, you might think that ordinary Mexicans would welcome an intervention. But you'd actually be wrong. After all, Mexican history is alive with periods when Uncle Sam came stomping in only to leave chaos in his wake. As the military journal Small Wars put it, the Mexican-American War, punitive expedition, cross-border raids, and the occupation of Veracruz are footnotes in US history books, but they are key components of the Mexican national narrative. In other words, the majority of Mexicans are unlikely to see an American assault on cartels in a particularly rosy light, especially given the ongoing catastrophe that is the Mexican drug war. Back in 2006, President Felipe Calderón initiated a military crackdown on what were then some of the biggest cartels, chief among them Los Zetas. Initially, it seemed like the policy could be called a success. Cartel leaders were killed, the deputies arrested, and scores of criminal networks smashed by land, air, and maritime units. But then a funny thing happened. As War on the Rocks records, instead of destroying these organizations, violence rose precipitously and spread beyond targeted communities. Drug trafficking, including into the US, continued as before. Rather than break, the cartels simply shattered into smaller gangs. Gangs that then began brutal turf wars to take control of newly contested territory. The experience of the Mexican military is a major reason why analysts are skeptical that an American initiative will achieve different results, especially when the US has its own recent track record of failing to curb drug gangs. Between 2017 and 2019, the Defense Department oversaw a massive campaign to end Taliban drug production in Afghanistan. Special forces were sent in to disrupt trafficking networks. Airstrikes blasted drug labs into flaming ruins. Yet the drugs never stopped flowing. Opium production actually increased. All this isn't to say there are no examples of US firepower breaking powerful cartels. As supporters of intervention in Mexico's drug war like to point out, Washington once helped smash the biggest of them all. At their height, the Medellin and Cali cartels were like nothing else on earth. Not only were they turning incredible profits shipping cocaine into the US, but they'd managed to put Colombian society into a stranglehold. Political figures sat in their pockets, security services were bought off. It was only thanks to American largesse that the two gangs were smashed. A follow-up initiative, Plan Colombia, spent $10 billion to help the Colombian state increase stability and likewise take out leftist guerrilla organizations that had moved into narcotic trafficking. From a Colombian perspective, the plan was mostly a success. There's no doubt the country became a safer place during the Plan Colombia years. No doubt, too, that the Medellin and Cali cartels no longer exist in any significant way. And while criminal gangs can still disrupt whole Colombian cities, they no longer have the reach or the power that they had before. From an American perspective, though, the plan might have to be called a failure, at least in its central conceit. Rather than end cocaine production and shipments into the United States, it simply shifted the networks north. Mexican cartels moved in to replace Colombian ones. Is there any reason to think smashing Mexico's cartels with brute firepower would have a different outcome? Probably not. But really, that may be the least of everyone's worries. Because when you really start to dig down into the ramifications of this plan, it becomes clear there are serious practical barriers. The concept of war with cartels seems like a straightforward one. I mean, there's a bunch of organized criminals down there in Mexico. Well, war would just mean Uncle Sam blowing them up. Of course, though, military planning is never as simple as that. Anyone embarking on even a limited military operation needs to think things through, to make contingency plans, to identify targets. It's at this point we get into our first speed bump. Even finding targets in such a mission will be fraught with danger. Speaking to the Washington Post, Falca Ernst, senior Mexico analyst for the International Crisis Group, outlined the ways cartels integrate into local communities, saying, the traffickers aren't small, isolated groups of outsiders, but people rooted in their communities with ties to local and national politicians, as well as security forces and business leaders. To take them out, he noted, you'd have to bomb the whole area. This gets at the inherent problem with fighting any gang. Rather than soldiers in uniforms, they're often members of the communities that you're trying to protect. Now, some countries embrace this. El Salvador has recently led a successful crackdown on gangs by mass imprisoning tens of thousands with no care for the innocents swept up in the dragnet. Let's be honest though, there's no way in hell the US could get away with such collateral damage, especially if it was operating on Mexican soil, targeting Mexican nationals. Nor would it necessarily work in this case. The Small Wars Journal has argued that, we should stop thinking about cartels as unified structures and try to see them as, quote, a transnational network of smaller and relatively independent businesses operating horizontally. This means there's a lot of room in the system for adaptability. Take out a leader and the system works around their death. Blow up a bunch of drug factories, and the remaining links in the chain reorient themselves to wherever the market provides opportunities. Speaking of blowing up drug factories, that too will present a fiendish challenge. Those who advocate bombing fentanyl production centers probably have in mind something like the Colombian cocaine factories of the past, sprawling places that can be quickly identified via satellite or are located with drones. Fentanyl production, though, is harder to spot. Here's the post again. Fentanyl labs are often small and simple. They don't emit heat signatures, chemical fumes, or powerful odors as methamphetamine labs do. Fentanyl can be made with small amounts of chemicals in kitchens, basements, or garages. End quote. Missile strikes, then, might be off the table. It's one thing to demolish a factory way out in the countryside, it's another to hit a random house in a small Mexican town, even if it's one you're 100% sure is churning out opioids. Of course, military intervention is only part of the proposed plans. Another is the potential to designate the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Yet even this wouldn't be straightforward. Back when President Trump was toying with the idea, War on the Rocks ran a lengthy article on the technical and legal issues. It's worth a read for all the ways it tries to argue against conflating gang crime with terrorism, but for our purposes, one section in this article really stands out. According to the article, the US legal definition of terrorism is premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. The key part there is politically motivated. As the piece argues, quote, Mexican drug cartels are not terrorists or insurgents because their goal is to maximize profit, not fundamentally change society and politics. Really though, none of that matters when placed against the most obvious obstacle of all, the lack of consent from the Mexican government. Without that, any adventure south of the border would be doomed from the start. The oddest part of the discussion about war with the cartels is that it routinely ignores what Mexico has to say. This isn't because the Mexican government is being cagey about its opinions or sending out mixed signals. They've repeatedly, loudly made it clear that this would be unacceptable. Here's Marcelo Ebrard, who was Secretary of Foreign Affairs until he recently resigned to run for president, on the idea of American military intervention in his nation. In one act, you'll destroy all the security cooperation between Mexico and the United States. Now, that's a pretty straightforward assessment, and it's likely widely shared. The Mexican government has previously retaliated over much smaller things than missile strikes. For example, just the act of designating the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations has caused huge diplomatic headaches. There's a reason Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump all quietly dropped the idea. More concretely, there's the recent case of General Salvador Cienfuegos. In 2020, the DEA arrested him in LA on suspicion of drug trafficking. The issue? Cienfuegos is a former Mexican defense secretary. When President Lopez Obrador found out, he blew his top. Since then, despite Cienfuegos being freed, Mexico has limited cooperation with the DEA, arguing it violates nation sovereignty. Again, this is a much smaller infraction on America's part than cruise missiles hitting the site of fentanyl production or US Special Forces conducting raids on Mexican soil. The idea that Washington could engage in even the most limited actions without agreement is absurd. As Small Wars wrote, this is even more true now than it was previously. A big thing in politics at the moment is the idea of nearshoring, returning crucial parts of supply chains from adversary nations like China to nearby partners like Canada or Mexico. Undertake unilateral military action, that all blows up. At a bare minimum, bilateral trade with Mexico would completely break down, scrambling supply chains and handing a huge advantage to America's competitors. As the journal Responsible Statecraft succinctly put it, the economic ramifications of invading one's second largest trading partner would be uniformly unpleasant. Our relations with Mexico and the rest of Latin America would not recover in our lifetimes. Still, let's assume that war with the cartels becomes official Republican policy and maybe US policy in 2024. Let's assume, too, that a change in Mexican politics leads to the faintest possibility of joint military action. What would that action actually look like? So in our final chapter today, we'll be digging into the military realities of taking out the cartels in order to find out. Although they are almost unanimously against strikes, the one thing military analysts seem to agree on is that fighting the cartels will only be possible with Mexico on side. If that happens, if the government somehow comes around to Washington's way of thinking, then you might be able to stitch together a successful intervention. Like Plan Colombia, it would involve the US donating large amounts of money and equipment to the Mexican military and working with them to achieve very specific outcomes. For example, that might include a combination of American and Mexican special forces cooperating to dismantle the most violent, most destabilizing cartels. Or it could be even smaller, a period of behavior modification where crackdowns are used to threaten the cartels into curbing their worst excesses. As the Small Wars Journal suggested, the most promising approach would be a sequential, focused, and systematic targeting strategy aimed at cartel behavior modification. Now, that's a lot less dramatic than sending cruise missiles smashing into drug labs, but it's also more likely to succeed. Not in ridding Mexico of the cartels, but in weakening their grip on certain regions, in forcing them to play nicer and commit fewer utterly egregious acts of violence. The plus side is that it would require little in the way of American military footprints. Working with and through the Mexican military would be the priority, limiting US involvement to intelligence and occasional deployment of special forces. The downside is that such an approach is unlikely to end the fentanyl crisis. While it would probably disrupt drug trafficking routes for a period, the cartels would eventually adjust. Per responsible statecraft, even if such an operation somehow succeeded, it would not stop the flow of drugs into the United States. The sad truth is that there will never be an end to the drug trade as long as Americans are willing to spend exceptional amounts of money to get high. Of course, the model outlined above is only one interpretation of a war with the cartels. The other envisages America going in without Mexico's consent, either in the form of airstrikes or conducting cross-border raids. So let's be clear. Even ignoring the damage this would do to the US-Mexico relationship, this gung-ho approach would likely end in disaster. As we mentioned back in our previous video on possible intervention in Haiti, there's little chance gang members would stand around waiting for Uncle Sam to arrive. Instead, they'd evaporate back into the communities they came from, disguising themselves as civilians until the danger was over. The same dynamic played out in Afghanistan, and it's a central reason the US never managed to crush the Taliban despite a 2-decade occupation. Not that occupation would be an option here. No matter what else changes, there is literally zero chance Mexico's government will accept American troops occupying its states, setting up roadblocks, and hunting for cartel members among the civilian population. Airstrikes and drone attacks, too, come with their own set of problems. Aside from the issues with targeting fentanyl labs that we outlined earlier, such strikes could very well kill civilians, as we saw happen on multiple occasions in Afghanistan. Those accidents caused outrage in Kabul, but since the government was being propped up by the US troop presence, it wasn't like they could kick the Americans out. Mexico has no such considerations the moment a single civilian was killed or hell would break loose. And Mexico is simply too important an economic and diplomatic partner for Congress to just shrug and say, oh well. While decades of over-the-horizon strikes in places like Afghanistan, Syria, and Pakistan may have given the impression that the US can do such things with impunity, that would not be the case below the border. At absolute best, it would create the mother of all diplomatic crises. At worst, it could destroy relations between the US and Mexico for decades to come. At the end of all that, then, we're basically back where we started, back with the broad opinion of the defense establishment that going to war with the cartels without Mexico's approval would be just a really, really bad idea. It's a frustrating feeling, for sure. Doubtless many of you watching this are desperate to see something done to find a way to stop the senseless deaths and collapsing communities caused by the fentanyl crisis. Others may be desperate to see the cartels get what's coming, to see these brutal organizations dismantled, to stop them sowing misery and terror in Mexico. To that, we can only say that we agree. It's awful that we live in a world in which cartel-aligned policemen can disappear 43 innocent students, in which drug dealers can become staggeringly wealthy, presiding over an empire of horrors. But sometimes we have to accept that the real world is what it is, a place where military power has its limits, where the sovereignty and dignity of Mexico is as important to protect as that of America. It may be that there's an unorthodox way to deal with the cartel problem that will actually work, but these plans are not it. And it's only once we accept their flaws that people might begin looking for a truly workable solution to this rather pressing problem.